The courtroom was quiet, almost eerily so. It was the kind of silence that felt heavier than any gavel strike, heavier than the wooden benches and stacks of paper that usually dominated the space. On this day, the usual routine, the shuffle of papers, the murmurs of lawyers, the tapping of pens, was absent. Instead, there was an almost tangible tension, a collective holding of breath, as if the room itself sensed that this was not an ordinary hearing. Sitting in the chair was a young college student, his posture small and hunched, his shoulders tense, and his hands trembling slightly as they rested in his lap. Every movement seemed measured, careful, as if he feared that any sudden gesture might break the fragile barrier holding his emotions at bay. His eyes, wide and glistening, scanned the courtroom briefly before lowering again, avoiding the gaze of anyone who might notice the storm inside him. Before him lay the tickets, minor violations, the sort that usually result in a small fine or a polite reprimand. On any other day, these tickets might have seemed burdensome, annoying, perhaps even a source of stress. But today they felt insignificant, almost absurd, compared to the crushing weight of the personal tragedy he had just endured. The student's father had passed away recently, and the loss hung over him like a heavy fog, suffocating and inescapable. Each ticket on the desk seemed almost irrelevant in the face of grief so profound, so raw, that it threatened to engulf him entirely. And yet he was here, carrying himself through this legal obligation, trying to maintain some semblance of control, of composure, even as the world around him seemed impossible to manage. Judge Frank Caprio, known for his deep compassion and unwavering fairness, looked at the young man carefully. His eyes, seasoned by decades on the bench, had seen countless cases, some tragic, some humorous, some both, and yet even for him, this moment demanded attention and sensitivity. He could see the grief etched into students' features, the exhaustion that comes not just from sleepless nights, but from the emotional labor of coping with a loss too vast for someone so young. There were silent questions in the young man's eyes, unspoken fears and anxieties about the future, about responsibilities suddenly thrust upon him without warning. Caprio's gaze was steady, gentle, and attentive, a silent acknowledgement that the courtroom was more than a place for law today. It was a place where human sorrow needed recognition, where empathy had a role as important as judgment. Every person in the courtroom felt it. The spectators, the clerks, the officers, and even those unfamiliar with the young man's story sensed that something profound was about to unfold. It was a moment charged not with anger or legal argument, but with raw humanity. There was an invisible weight in the air, almost like a gravitational pull drawing attention inward, forcing everyone to focus on the young student and the emotional reality he carried. No one spoke. Even the faintest whisper seemed intrusive in the delicate tension of the room. The audience's hearts seemed to synchronize with his, beating faster with every subtle gesture he made, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the brief inhale as he tried to steady himself, the small tremble in his voice as he prepared to speak. The student's gaze occasionally flicked to the tickets on the desk. These small pieces of paper, usually mundane and inconsequential, now seemed absurdly trivial in comparison to the invisible burdens he bore. Each fine represented something he had failed to manage, but in reality, he had failed at none of his responsibilities. Life itself had imposed failures upon him, and these tickets seemed almost cruelly irrelevant against the enormity of grief. And yet he had come, he had taken his place in the chair, and he was attempting to face the world outside the shadows of loss. There was a bravery in this, a quiet courage that only those who have faced overwhelming grief can understand, the courage to show up, to participate, to navigate even the smallest challenges while carrying a heart too heavy for any ordinary human to bear. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the bench, his expression softening as he prepared to speak. He had seen sorrow before, had observed countless moments of stress and despair, but there was something about this particular combination of youth, loss, and quiet dignity that required a more profound approach. He did not rush, did not interrupt, did not lecture. He allowed the silence to linger for a heartbeat, long enough for the room to absorb the weight of the moment. In that brief pause, every individual present became acutely aware of the human story unfolding before them. A family coping with sudden tragedy, a young man forced to face responsibilities alone, and a legal system meeting human grief in a moment it was never fully prepared to handle. As the judge began to speak, His tone was measured, empathetic, almost conversational. He asked about the student's situation gently, as if he were speaking to someone he knew personally, not merely a defendant before the court. The words were simple, but they carried immense weight. Each question, each nod, each acknowledgement was a recognition of the invisible burdens the young man bore. The courtroom leaned in metaphorically and literally, sensing the tension and anticipation. The young student's responses were soft, occasionally broken by a sigh or a catch in the throat, and each admission seemed to magnify the gravity of the moment rather than diminish it. Observers could see the emotional layers building subtly but unmistakably. The parents or family members who had accompanied the student sat with quiet dignity, their expressions a mix of sorrow and hope, leaning in to witness how the law would interact with this deeply human moment. Jurors, court clerks, and even the attending officers could not help but be drawn into the unfolding narrative. This was not a case about justice in the abstract, not about fines and tickets alone. It was a story of compassion, grief, responsibility, and the intersection of law with raw human emotion. Everyone felt the invisible threads connecting them to the young man's sorrow, threads that were almost palpable in their tension and fragility. The young student took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked down at the tickets once more, then up at Judge Caprio, who nodded gently, silently encouraging him to speak. His voice, when it came, was quiet but audible, carrying the weight of grief in every syllable. He described the recent passing of his father, the sudden shift in responsibilities, the loneliness and overwhelm that had come with it. His words were simple, factual, but every listener could feel the depth of emotion behind them. It was a testimony not just to a legal situation, but to a personal tragedy that words alone could scarcely capture. Judge Caprio listened, fully present, his eyes attentive, his face calm yet expressive. He understood that the courtroom today was more than a place for legal procedure. It was a stage for compassion, a forum for humanity, a space where a young man's sorrow could be acknowledged and met with understanding rather than judgment. He carefully reviewed the tickets, weighing their importance against the human reality before him. The decision he was about to make would not simply resolve minor infractions. It would validate the humanity of a student, recognize the pain of loss, and provide a rare moment of grace in a world that often feels indifferent to suffering. The room held its collective breath, aware that history, in a small but profound way, was unfolding. Every subtle movement, the tremble of the student's hand, the glimmer of tears in his eyes, the gentle nods of understanding from Judge Caprio, was magnified. It was a moment where law and humanity intersected perfectly, where the technicalities of tickets faded into insignificance in the presence of real grief, and where everyone in the room was reminded that sometimes justice is not only about enforcement, it is about compassion, empathy, and acknowledgement of human struggle. The judge leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the polished wooden bench. His eyes, seasoned and perceptive from years on the bench, were fixed gently on the young student before him. There was no rush, no hint of impatience, just a calm, unwavering presence that seemed to anchor the tension in the room. It was clear that Judge Frank Caprio understood the delicate balance he needed to maintain. The law still needed to be observed, the tickets technically still stood, yet the human heart required acknowledgement and compassion that could not be measured on a piece of paper. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, the air thick with anticipation, as everyone present sensed that this moment was unlike any ordinary hearing. The judge's voice was soft but deliberate as he asked about the student's situation, his tone carrying empathy without condescension, understanding without pity. The student's story began to unfold slowly, tentatively, as though speaking aloud the painful truth might somehow make it more bearable. He described the recent passing of his father, the void left in his life, and the sudden weight of responsibilities that had been thrust upon him alone. With each word, the gravity of his loss became more apparent, not only to the judge but to everyone in the room. There was a profound silence that followed each sentence, a collective pause as the courtroom absorbed the depth of grief, the suddenness of tragedy, and the quiet courage of a young man attempting to navigate life in the aftermath of such loss. The courtroom held its breath. The usual ambient sounds, the rustle of papers, the whisper of pens, the faint cough of a spectator, were gone, replaced by a profound stillness. Every eye was on the student, not in judgment, but in empathetic witness. Judges, clerks, spectators, and lawyers all sensed the extraordinary weight of the moment. Even those accustomed to witnessing human suffering in courtrooms felt a tension they could not ignore, a tight knot in the stomach that accompanies true empathy. Every movement, every glance, every slight intake of breath carried significance. The student's hands fidgeted subtly, his fingers intertwining and releasing nervously, a silent indicator of the storm of emotions swirling inside him. His eyes, brimming with moisture, avoided the gaze of others, yet could not hide the vulnerability, the fatigue, and the deep sorrow that lingered on his face. Judge Caprio listened carefully, nodding occasionally, his expression softening as he absorbed the magnitude of the student's situation. There was no need for dramatics. The story itself carried the drama, the emotion, the stakes. He methodically reviewed the tickets, glancing at each one as if measuring their weight against the reality of the student's grief. Minor violations, perhaps even trivial infractions on any ordinary day, now seemed absurdly insignificant when placed alongside a life disrupted by loss, a young man navigating a world suddenly emptied of parental guidance. With each review, the courtroom sensed the judge's internal deliberation, a mental weighing of law against humanity, of procedure against compassion, of rules against the quiet necessity of mercy. And then came the moment that would be etched into the memory of everyone present. With quiet decisiveness, Judge Caprio made a decision that transcended paperwork, bureaucracy, and legal minutiae. He dismissed every single ticket before the student. The weight of relief was instantaneous. The young man exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly for the first time in what must have felt like endless hours, if not days. Yet even as relief washed over him, the vulnerability remained. Grief did not evaporate in the presence of mercy. It lingered, raw and unprocessed, a reminder of the fragility of life and the sudden, unpredictable hardships it can deliver. His eyes glistened with moisture, reflecting both the sorrow of loss and the sudden relief of being seen, acknowledged, and granted a reprieve. Then, in a moment of profound humanity, the judge did something that elevated the experience from a legal proceeding to a deeply human interaction. He stood, leaving the weight of the bench behind him, and walked slowly toward the young student. The room seemed to exhale collectively, as if even the air recognized the significance of what was about to occur. When Judge Caprio embraced the young man, it was more than a gesture of pity or ceremonial formality. It was a profound acknowledgement of suffering, an unspoken promise of empathy, a recognition that law and humanity can intersect in moments of grace. The hug itself seemed to carry decades of judicial experience, tempered with the wisdom that sometimes rules alone are insufficient, and that compassion can be the most powerful judgment of all. The courtroom was silent, yet the emotional resonance was palpable. Every person in the room, from clerks to spectators, from officers to the few journalists present, felt the weight of that embrace. It was as though the hug itself communicated volumes that words never could. Understanding, kindness, empathy, and the recognition of a young life weighed down by grief. The gesture transformed the room. What had begun as a series of tickets and minor infractions had evolved into a human story that spoke to anyone capable of witnessing sorrow, resilience, and mercy. The young man's relief was visible, yet it did not erase the layers of grief that remained. Tears shimmered in his eyes as he met the judge's gaze briefly, an acknowledgement of shared humanity and mutual respect. It was a moment that transcended the transactional nature of the legal system and became a narrative of empathy that would resonate far beyond the courtroom walls. People who witnessed it would remember not the tickets, not the minor violations, but the courage it took for the young student to sit in that chair and the compassion it took for the judge to respond with humanity rather than rigidity. Every subtle detail mattered. The way the student's shoulders relaxed slightly, the quiver in his lips as he tried to hold back further emotion, the gentle squeeze of the judge's hand during the embrace. All these micro-moments were magnified by the intensity of the courtroom atmosphere. Observers could feel the tension in their own chests, their own hearts reflecting the shared emotional journey. This was more than empathy. It was a collective human experience, a testament to the power of understanding, and a reminder that law, when administered with compassion, can become a force for healing rather than merely punishment. Even after the embrace ended, the energy of the moment lingered. The young student sat back, tears still in his eyes, a small smile breaking through the heaviness of grief. The courtroom remained quiet, but was not the tense silence of anticipation anymore. It was the reverent silence of witnesses to something profound. Lawyers whispered softly among themselves, clerks glanced up with reflective expressions, and jurors leaned back in their chairs, absorbing the lesson that sometimes the human element matters more than the legal one. The air itself seemed lighter, as though the shared experience had created a moment of collective catharsis, a rare intersection of grief, relief, and understanding. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, seated again with a calm authority, but the room had been changed. The act of dismissing the tickets, while legally minor, carried a significance that no paperwork could measure. It spoke of empathy in action, of humanity in practice, and of the rare moments when the justice system meets life's unpredictability with grace. And for the young student, the impact was personal, immediate, and profound. He had been recognized, his grief had been seen, and for the first time in days or weeks, he could feel a small sense of relief, a fleeting lightness in the shadow of loss. This moment, simple yet extraordinary, serves as a reminder of the extraordinary power of empathy in human experience. It reminds us that laws and rules, while important, cannot fully address the needs of the human heart. That sometimes the courage to understand, the willingness to forgive, and the act of simply acknowledging suffering can carry more weight than any legal judgment ever could. And in that silent courtroom, with a young man relieved and a judge standing with compassion, everyone present, and anyone who would later witness the video, was reminded of the profound impact one person's humanity can have on another. This moment, though centered on something as seemingly mundane as parking tickets or minor legal infractions, became so much more than that. It transcended the boundaries of law and regulation, showing the world that within the strict procedures and technicalities of a courtroom, there exists room for humanity, empathy, and compassion. While most of us may never step into a courtroom like that, watching a story unfold like this reminds us that the law is not merely about rules, fines, or enforcement, it is about people. And in this particular case, it was about one young man facing the raw, unfiltered grief of losing a parent, and the rare but transformative act of a judge responding not just with legal authority, but with human understanding. Judge Frank Caprio did not merely dismiss the tickets because he had the power to do so. He recognized in that moment the weight of the world on a young person's shoulders. The loss of a parent is an experience that reshapes everything: emotional stability, daily routines, and the sense of security that every human relies upon. For this young college student, life had shifted in an instant. Responsibilities that might have seemed manageable in ordinary circumstances now felt like an insurmountable mountain. And yet here he was sitting in a courtroom, confronted not only with the grief of his loss, but with the technical obligations of society's rules. Most people might see these as minor, trivial burdens, tickets to pay, minor violations to be addressed, but the cumulative emotional load on this student transformed them into symbols of an almost impossible challenge. The courtroom, a place usually defined by order, control, and decorum, became a theater of raw human emotion. The observers, from the clerks to the spectators, even the few journalists in attendance, felt it: the gravity of the moment, the tension of grief and vulnerability, and the quiet courage it took for the young man to maintain composure. Every subtle gesture, the trembling of a hand, the avoidance of eye contact, the quiet sigh, told a story louder than any words could. And when Judge Caprio chose to dismiss the tickets, he validated not only the student's immediate predicament, but also his humanity. The act was small in bureaucratic terms, but monumental in emotional significance. It sent a message to everyone present, and eventually to millions who would watch the video online. The law can be firm, but it can also be kind. Rules exist, yes, but they should never overshadow the human experience at their core. Then came the embrace, an act so simple, yet so profound that it transcended the formalities of a courtroom and touched something deep within the human psyche. A hug, a gesture so ordinary in everyday life, became a symbol of understanding, compassion, and shared humanity. The courtroom remained silent during that moment, but the silence was not empty. It was full, thick with the emotional resonance of what was occurring. Those witnessing it felt the weight of grief, relief, and empathy as though they were part of the embrace themselves. Every nuance, the judge's careful, steady hold, the young man's head lowering slightly as tears threatened to spill, the gentle reassurance implicit in that physical connection communicated volumes that legal language could never capture. What made this moment viral, what captured the attention of viewers across the nation, was not the dismissal of fines or tickets alone. Millions saw the video and felt something profoundly human, the recognition that empathy, mercy, and kindness are powerful forces in our world. It reminded viewers that justice is not only about punishment, it is also about understanding, about seeing people for who they truly are, about responding to suffering with grace rather than rigidity. In a society often dominated by transactional interactions, bureaucratic procedures, and impersonal regulations, witnessing such a raw, compassionate act struck a chord. People felt it viscerally because deep down, everyone has faced moments of vulnerability, grief, or loss where they long for someone to recognize their struggle. Judge Caprio's decision illustrated an essential truth. Rules are necessary, but they must be tempered with discretion and empathy. The embrace and ticket dismissal were more than courtroom actions, they were lessons in humanity. They reminded those watching that law, when applied with understanding, can heal rather than punish, uplift rather than oppress. The moment demonstrated that human connection and compassion are not weaknesses in the system. They are what give the system legitimacy, what remind us that behind every legal proceeding lies a human story. The ripple effect of this moment extended far beyond the courtroom walls. Social media platforms, news outlets, and viewers around the globe shared, commented, and reflected on the video. Millions of people empathized with the student, imagining the weight of his grief and the relief of that simple act of understanding. Discussions arose about the role of empathy in society, the importance of compassion in legal systems, and how small acts of kindness can dramatically impact lives. In the quiet gesture of a hug, viewers recognized a lesson that is often overlooked in daily life, that acknowledging another person's suffering and responding with care can leave a mark more profound than any legal ruling, financial settlement, or policy could achieve. The young man, of course, felt the most immediate impact. The relief he experienced was not only the lifting of financial burden, but the reassurance that he was not alone. That in a world that can often feel cold, rigid, and unyielding, there exists at least one person willing to see the human heart behind the rules. His vulnerability, once raw and exposed, was met with compassion rather than judgment, and that experience, so fleeting in minutes but so transformative in significance, would stay with him for a lifetime. It was a moment of validation, of connection, of recognition, and ultimately of hope. It also highlighted the unique power of human empathy within institutional frameworks. Often legal systems are criticized for being impersonal, cold, or detached from real human experiences. But this moment served as a testament that even within structured systems, individuals can exercise judgment tempered by humanity. The balance between fairness and empathy is delicate, yet Judge Caprio demonstrated that it is possible. The hug, the dismissal of tickets, the attentive listening, all were acts that bridge the gap between institutional procedure and the human heart, creating a narrative of compassion that resonated far beyond any legal textbook or courtroom manual. Ultimately, the story reminds viewers of a universal truth. Life is unpredictable, grief is inevitable, and human connections matter more than we often realize. While rules and regulations serve their purpose, it is our capacity to empathize, to offer mercy, and to recognize the humanity in others that leaves a lasting impact. Millions who watched the viral video understood this instinctively, feeling an emotional resonance that transcended the screen, connecting them to the young student's story, Judge Caprio's compassion, and the enduring lesson that kindness, even in small doses, can create ripples that extend across time and space. This wasn't just a courtroom moment. It was a lesson in life. It demonstrated that while legal structures are necessary to maintain order, they do not exist in a vacuum. They exist to serve people. And serving people sometimes requires more than strict enforcement. It requires listening, understanding, and responding to the context of human experience. Judge Caprio's actions embodied this philosophy, and in doing so, he created a moment of profound human connection that millions could witness and remember. The embrace, the dismissal, and the palpable understanding shared between judge and student became a symbol of hope, mercy, and the enduring power of compassion. In the end, the story resonates because it reminds us that behind every law, every regulation, every ticket, there is a human story. Behind every minor infraction, there is a person navigating life's complexities, griefs, and struggles. And while rules are essential, the way we administer them, tempered with empathy, kindness, and humanity, is what ultimately leaves a lasting legacy. Judge Frank Caprio's gesture serves as a powerful reminder that small acts of mercy, recognition, and compassion can resonate far more than rigid enforcement ever could. It is a lesson that transcends the courtroom, touching the hearts of millions, teaching that justice and empathy are not mutually exclusive. They are most powerful when they coexist. And as the young student walked out of the courtroom, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. One simple act of compassion had transformed an ordinary day into a moment of hope, mercy, and human connection. Judge Caprio reminded us all that behind every law, every rule, every ticket, there are real lives, real emotions, and real people. Sometimes, the greatest lessons are not written in statutes, they're lived in moments of empathy. If this story moved you, subscribe our channel, share it, and remember, even the smallest act of kindness can make a world of difference.